Hello and welcome to Burlington's Election Forum. My name is Alan Foulds and I'll be moderating the discussion. I'm joined by Greg Walsh to present the questions. Greg is BNEWS producer here at BCAT. For this discussion, we focus on the upcoming town ballot decision on the CPA, the Community Preservation Act. We have two spokespersons for the issue. Jon Sachs will represent the yes arguments, while John Iler will represent the no side. Both John and John are town meeting members. Welcome, everyone. Here's how we will proceed. Each speaker will offer a 1-minute opening statement. By the coin flip, we have decided that Jon Sachs will go first. After that, Greg Walsh of BNEWS will ask questions of the speakers. Each speaker has 90 seconds to respond. We'll alternate between each side of the issue for the first response. Finally, each speaker will give a 2-minute closing statement. If either speaker wants to rebut something that has been said, that is the time to do it. In the interest of keeping this moving, we'll keep a close watch on the time. I'll give each of the speakers a 30-second wave to let you know you got 30 seconds left. So frame your responses accordingly. Well, if everyone's all set, we will get started. We'll begin with Jon Sachs for his opening remarks. You have 1 minute. John?
Thank you. First of all, I want to say thanks to BCAT and to John Iler. I have a great deal of respect for John Iler, although we disagree on this particular topic. I have voted with him in town meeting, but not every time. The Community Preservation Act, I've written a little thing here so I don't get too tongue-tied. It's a state program that encourages cities and towns to protect open space, improve parks, save historic buildings, and provide affordable housing for the most vulnerable. 189 cities and towns have joined CPA. Any community can vote to leave. Not one has ever done so. There is a surtax that will be added if CPA passes. We estimate most homeowners in Burlington will pay on the order of $78 a year. Some more, some even less. But the opt-out levels for low and moderate income seniors are extremely generous. For example, a 2-person household of seniors making less than $112,000.
All right, John, try to wrap it up.
Does not have to pay. And I think as we go through the debate tonight, I think you'll learn a lot more about the ins and outs of CPA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now John Iler.
Thank you, Alan. And thank you to the BCAT team for creating this debate on the CPA ballot question. Approval of CPA will add a property tax surcharge of $90 for a $700,000 home. The surcharge increases each year right along with property taxes. Renters, which are generally lower income, will have CPA surcharges passed on to them by their landlords, and they'll have no way to opt out of CPA. CPA money can only be spent on historic resources, community housing, and open space/recreation. CPA funds may not be spent on operating budgets nor on maintenance. The CPA may not be used to fund operations on our existing parks, nor for rehabilitation and restoration of landlocked forest. CPA funds may not be used to build our anticipated new police station. The state does provide a partial match for town-raised CPA funds. However, the match rate has widely varied as the law allows it to be as low as 5%. Therefore, vote no on CPA to avoid another property tax increase and allow for responsible budgeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we go to the second part of this debate, questions from BCAT. We'll begin, Mr. Walsh, and the question will first go to Mr. Sachs.
Hi, thank you for both being here today. What type of projects can and cannot be funded with the CPA?
And Mr. Sachs, you answer first.
It's very clear, as Mr. Iler said, they are very, very focused. They have to be open space, recreation, affordable housing, and historic preservation. It is true that you cannot fund ongoing operating expenses, so anything that's passed by CPA has to be passed with an understanding that you want to very much limit the increases to operating expenses. But I would posit that if we have better fields, better athletic fields that aren't flooding as much, it isn't going to cost any more to cut them. In fact, it might actually cost a little bit less. if we put bathrooms at some of our parks so little children don't have to be changed in a porta potty, I don't think that would be an operating expense. I don't think a couple of bathrooms or even 4 in town is going to be a massive increase to our operating expense. I would take issue with what Mr. Iler said about landlocked forest. I don't know of anything that would prevent the town from making improvements to the landlocked forest using CPA money. I think that's not true, but we can possibly have town attorney or somebody check that. As far as I'm understanding, when 10 years ago, the legislature updated the CPA law so that any town property, no matter how it came about, it can be updated in terms of recreation with CPA money. And if you look at it, almost every town that's a CPA town uses tons of CPA
to wrap
money.
it up.
And in fact, keep in mind that there are these 3 or 4 targeted areas, depending on how you want to label it. Open space and recreation could be thought of as one. We only have to put 10% of the money in each category. That leaves it up to the town where 70% of the money goes.
Okay,
So
we're
we
now
have
well
an
over the
enormous-
1.5. Okay, just
We have enormous flexibility on where we actually put our CPA money.
Thank you. Mr. Iler, the same question?
Okay, as far as the landlocked forest goes, I'm looking at a chart from Department of Revenue from October 2012, but that is the one that's current on the website that describes that if open space was not acquired with CPA funds, then it cannot be spent on rehabilitation and restoration projects. That isn't to say it can't be used at all in there, just not for specific areas. So it's restricted in how it can be used. It's not prohibited, but it is restricted. As Mr. Sachs says, there are these 3 key areas that it can be spent in. But the key thing is that the law is designed to ensure that any spending is, quote, new spending. So in particular, it can't be used for operations and maintenance. It has to be effectively new capital projects. So if you're adding new equipment or new bathrooms, as Mr. Sachs says, that would be perfectly fine. But the important thing to realize with that is as these things are added, or as we create new CPA properties through whatever mechanism, suppose we spend it to rehabilitate a historic house, the operation and maintenance of that now must be done with non-CPA budget money. So the baseline budget increases as we expand our number of CPA projects over time. And I believe my time's up.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now move on to the next question. Greg?
What are the pros and cons of joining the CPA?
And we'll begin with Mr. Iler on this.
I'm going to focus on the cons. I think that the biggest problem is that it's creating an earmark. So this is money that can only be spent on these 3 areas no matter what. So as I gave an example before, if we want to make a new police station and that's determined to be our main priority, then that we cannot take money from buying a historic building or putting it into affordable housing or what have you. It restricts our budgeting process, and I would say distorts it. So in particular, ideally, you would like to have your budgeting be done whereby you look at all your projects that you're interested in doing, long and short term in the town. You decide what tax burden you're willing to put upon the taxpayers. And then you pick your projects that you think make the most sense out of that list. In this way, quote, the most important projects get done first. And if CPA projects make the cut, then that's great. That's our priority. But if they don't make the cut, then maybe that's the town saying these are not our priority relative to other things. So it distorts that budget process by saying these things get funded no matter what, even if they aren't the top priority. So that's probably my biggest concern with it.
Thank you. Mr. Sachs, the same question.
Well, I think clearly one of the outstanding features is that the state has been collecting money from every real estate transaction since the year 2000, including refinances. And they have a big chunk of state money that they use as matching funds. Now, in the very early days, it was 100%. If the town raised $1 million, they would give you $1 million. And obviously that couldn't continue. It has dwindled down to 20%, 30%. Last year, 40%. So suppose Burlington raised $1 million. They would get $400,000 of state money that otherwise would be lost. And I think that the state match is a tremendously significant chunk of money. In my speaking to people from other CPA towns, they all regarded the state match as extremely important money that otherwise we won't get. Now, we'll never get back the money that we put in to the state fund over the last 20 years. You can't go backwards. But if we don't join CPA, we're going to continue paying those fees and never get it back. It just doesn't make any sense to throw money away. Does it make sense to spend a little bit more to get it back? Well, let me say this. I would say that we have a budget of close to $160 million in this town. Big budget. The CPA money that we collect from the surtax and from the state is more along the lines of $2 million. It's a little tiny fraction of the total budget, but it's earmarked for things that I believe a lot of people care about: preserving open space, improving our playgrounds, providing housing for vulnerable people, and saving historical buildings.
Okay, thank you very much. We will now move on to question number 3. Mr. Walsh.
Are some people eligible to be exempt from this tax? For example, people who lived on a fixed income. Is there an income limit that residents can ask to opt out of the tax?
And we'll start with Mr. Sachs.
Yes, I mentioned before that I think that the opt-out limits are actually quite generous. For example, as I mentioned in my little opening statement, there's a little table which is in the flyer that we've been passing out. But basically, think about a 2-person household of seniors, and they're making $112,000 or less. They don't have to pay. As a matter of fact, I checked, I don't have to pay. I'm living largely on Social Security. I won't opt out because to me, the $78, $90, $100 a year is really not terribly significant. It's about what I would spend going out to dinner with some friends. But if you really are pressed, I would posit that hardly anybody in this community, low income or moderate income seniors, is going to be stressed by this because they can opt out at extremely generous levels.
All set. Mr. Iler.
There is this concept of opting out depending on your income level, and that in principle sounds good, but there's a few issues with that. One is you do need to apply each year for this exemption, so it's a bit tedious to do, and if you're low income, that may not be where you want to be spending your time. Probably a more significant thing is the Housing Partnership just a few months ago came out with a housing needs assessment report. And in that report, there's about 9,700 households in Burlington. Of that, there's this concept of people that are cost burdened in their housing, where more than 30% of their income is being used for housing. And if we look at that, it turns out that there's 1,129 rental households that are cost burdened and 1,581 homeowners that are cost burdened. So what this means is 45% of people that are housing cost burdened are renters. And those renters, because they're not paying CPA directly, but are paying it as a pass-through on their rent from the landlord, actually have no way of opting out. So you're basically taking about half the people that are cost burdened are low income people, and they have no viable way of opting out. So the opting out process is not as beneficial as people might suggest.
Thank you very much. Now we move on to question 4. Again, Greg Walsh.
How is the committee that oversees how CPA funds are spent formed? Who is the body that oversees the CPA?
We'll begin with Mr. Iler.
Thank you. So this is defined in the law, and there are some, basically the CPC committee has mandatory members, which include representatives of the key areas where money to be spent. So recreation, I think planning is in there, historical commission, and I think I'm missing one. In addition, there can be other members that are appointed to this board, and how that's done would be set up by a bylaw that Burlington hasn't written yet and would need to write. So in particular, those additional people could be appointed by either the select board or by the town moderator or some combination thereof. So, hopefully it would be somewhat representative of the community at large. I know there's various proposals out there already, so we'll see how that shakes out. Obviously, the need for this committee, it won't be there unless the law passes. So that would be the next logical step. There has to be enabling legislation in our bylaws that would define things like the CPC.
Thank you. Same question, Mr. Sachs.
Yeah, what John said is entirely accurate. Our guess, our committee is a campaign committee. We're going to disappear on November 8th when the polls close. The CPC that the town forms has nothing to do with our committee. Can I say that nobody from our committee be on it? I have no idea. I really don't know. However, we kind of guessed that if this vote passes on November 8th, that it's probably not going to be smart to rush the bylaw for a January vote, because there's going to be a lot of back and forth about the very specifics of the bylaw, which are very binding. So probably it'll come up in the next May town meeting, and that obviously pushed back the implementation of the whole project. And when we spoke to the Chamber of Commerce to see what they felt about CPA, they said two things to us. One is that they were not going to take a stand against it or for it. And the other thing was that they kind of like to have one of the representative spots, which seems like a reasonable thing. One of the optional spots could be from the business community.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to question 5. This will go first to Mr. Sachs, but Greg, would like to ask the question?
Okay. How are the administrative expenses for the CPA committee managed and are kept to a minimum? How is it ensured the money is put into projects versus administrative expenses?
Yeah, that's a pretty easy one. The CPA law is very, very clear. It says you have a pot of money, 10% has to go to each of the target areas, so that you can't ever totally ignore a target area. But only 5% can ever go into administration. And actually, that's a max. So if the CPC committee in this town said, we really need somebody paid to keep track of things, 5% of all of the money as an absolute max could be spent to hire that person.
Thank you. Mr. Iler?
Yeah, Mr. Sachs is entirely correct. The law limits it to 5% of the total. So, what might this typically be used for? It would be used for audits of how the funds are spent, make sure that they're being spent in the appropriate areas and on projects that meet the CPA law. There would be staff like recording clerks and so on. So it doesn't, I don't think it would be a real issue staying within that 5% particularly. Since Mr. Sachs brought up the Chamber of Commerce, I'll just mention there that we talk a lot about what it will cost for residents to pay the surcharge, but we should realize that the the business community is also paying this, and since their tax rate is roughly 2.5 times what the residential rate is for a given property at a given price, they're paying roughly 2.5 times as much as a residence would. So it's not surprising they'd like to see at the table, since much like our regular property taxes, they're paying the lion's share of the surcharges also for CPA.
Thank you. Now we move on to question 6. Mr. Walsh.
Who can make proposals for the money, and how do the ideas for the projects come into the CPA?
And we begin with Mr. Iler.
Yeah, I mean, the quick answer is anyone can make proposals. So the process is that it could be a board, say the Recreation Commission might come in and say, we'd like to buy a new park somewhere or buy land for a park. They would go to the CPA committee and make that proposal, say, okay, we'd like to spend this amount of money for this project. That committee would vote on it, and if they like the project, it would then be passed on to town meeting as a warrant article. In town meeting, then town meeting would need to approve each expenditure from the CPA funds that have passed through the CPA committee. And if it passes town meeting, then it would be spent. Realistically, we have 3 town meetings a year. So that means that there's basically 3 opportunities a year for things to come before town meeting as CPA projects and be voted on. But these ideas can really come from anywhere. I would imagine there'll be folks like the sculpture park, I know near and dear to someone that might like to spend money. I'm sure the Historical Commission and Rec Commission would also have ideas, but I'm sure there's individuals that have ideas on this too.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Sachs.
Yeah, let me just say that it's a personal annoyance of mine that CPA really does not have any allowance for art. We'd have to stretch things to spend it on the sculpture park. We'd have to call it open space or recreation. And personally, who knows? One of the first things I did when I got involved in this campaign was to go and contact people from other communities nearby and say, how does this work? Is there a lot of immediate infighting about who gets the money? Because the money is significant. It's small compared to the town budget, but I think it's going to be over $2 million for us, and that's a lot of money. So I said, does it destabilize the communities? Does it make for more angst in the community? And everybody I spoke to said no. And in fact, I don't know how I feel about this. John's absolutely right. Anybody can make a proposal. And by the way, all of the CPC, the town community preservation committee, all of their meetings are going to be completely open and public. There's not going to be any backroom deals here. But the thing is that what I learned is that in general, it is in fact existing departments, that a lot of their actual proposals for rec will come from rec, and from history will come from historical commission, and so on and so forth. But it is by no means closed to the citizens or the business community come through and say, we want to do this. And, I've been in town meeting for about 10 years, and I'll tell you that, generally speaking, things generally get voted up in town meeting if the major committees, the hardworking committees like, John Iler and the Ways and Means have voted for them. People say, okay, if all those people agree, we're going to vote for it. But I will tell you this. If a project does not pass the smell test, if you come up in town meeting and say, we're going to spend $30,000 or $300,000 on this, it better pass the smell test, because otherwise people are just going to say, you're nuts. We're not going to vote for that. So it's really within the control of the town. Now, I don't know what happens if the town meeting votes no on everything for 10 years. I guess those amounts of money just pile up, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Thank you. All right, for question 7, Greg Walsh.
Okay, we mentioned businesses earlier. They pay roughly 2/3 of the tax base, and residents pay 1/3 of the total tax burden. How would the CPA affect businesses directly?
And we'll start with Mr. Sachs.
Well, there is no question that it isn't going to increase. And when we say it's $70, $80, $90 a year for a home, then you're talking about, if you own a $6 million building, now you're talking about a bit more money. And this is why the first thing that we did was approach the chamber, because if the chamber was going to launch a huge offensive against this, we might have dropped it. But we never got that message. And in fact, our understanding was that a lot of the major company management in town actually live in CPA towns, and they like what they see. Plus which, some of the things that CPA will do, such as better open space, boardwalks in some of the open space areas that are now inaccessible, would actually be quite a benefit to the employers, because they're amenities for their workers. There are things in town that there weren't there before. And I could, obviously affordable housing is iffy depending on what kind of affordable housing it is. There are some employers that would benefit from that, because if you run a restaurant right now, almost everybody comes down by bus from Lowell, because nobody in a restaurant can live in Burlington. But I think that it will have an effect. Now, one of the questions that comes up is, how much is it going to affect the rent of the small businesses? And what I'm going to suggest is this.
Begin to wrap it up.
If you're paying rent in a storefront business in Burlington, the portion of your rent that represents taxes is a very small chunk of your rent. So if they have a triple net lease and they pass along the increase to you, it's actually not going to be that much, because it's already just a percentage of your overall rent. Your rent's not going to go up by 1.5%.
Thank you. Mr. Iler?
Thank you. Just to agree with Mr. Sachs on if money is not spent in a given year, it does carry over to the next year and still has to stay, that minimum 10% has to stay in the historic recreation or open space bucket. So town meeting merely saying no doesn't allow us to not spend the money. It just gets carried over, so that money is earmarked forever. And in fact, if there are revenue bonds done in that money, we can't get out of CPA until those revenue bonds are paid off. So as Mr. Sachs pointed out, the Chamber of Commerce opted not to take a position for or against this. In terms of putting some real numbers to this, if we look at $1 million property, commercial property, that would be about $360 of CPA surcharge. And whether you're a resident or you're a business, you can be sure the landlord will pass through the full surcharge to the renter. It only makes economic sense. So this is directly passed to them. And of course, it's up to them if they think that's a good thing overall or not. But the business community is paying about 2/3 of the current taxes and surcharge. So they don't get a vote on this, sadly for them.
Okay, Thank you. Question number 8, Greg.
How many municipalities are members now? And as more cities and towns join, will the state's match decline?
We'll begin with Mr. Iler.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's 189 of 349 Massachusetts communities that are in CPA, which means there's 160 that aren't. About 46% are not in CPA. And much has been made about how towns can withdraw if they want to, but in fact, it's quite difficult. So I think the Yes CPA committee would attest to the difficulty in getting it on the ballot in the first place. I know they spent many years doing that project, so kudos to them for getting it on. So the point is, in order to get it off, you'd have to go through the exact same process to get it on a town-wide ballot. And this can only be done once the community's been in CPA for at least 5 years. So it's interesting to note that 28 communities, which is 15% of those in CPA, started in 2017 or later, so they couldn't withdraw even if they wanted to. And then, as I pointed out, if they happen to have CPA revenue bonds, they can't withdraw until those are paid off in addition. So But you're correct. As more join, the bucket of money or the pie is sliced into more slices, and there is less to go around. And I should note that this year, revenues going into the CPA trust fund are down 22% relative to the previous year. So one might imagine that even without communities joining, there's going to be a smaller pie for everyone.
Thank you. Mr. Sachs, the same question.
Well, as I mentioned before, in the very, very early days when there were like 3 communities, they would get 100% match, and obviously that wasn't going to continue. Let's look at Arlington, who joined not that long ago. They joined, started up around 2017. So their match was 20%, 17%, 19%, 23%, 28%, 43%. One thing that's important to note is that the state actually doubled the fees that contribute to the CPA fund so that there would be even more money. Now, if the whole concept annoys you, that I'm sure will annoy you even more. But nevertheless, the Commonwealth has been very committed to the CPA, and they increased the amount of money going in so that it wouldn't become insignificant. And I would say that 20% return on your money, that's a lot more than you're going to get at the bank, even with inflation anytime soon. So, good enough.
Okay. All right. Question 9, Mr. Walsh.
This is the last question, gentlemen. Can you see a scenario where the CPA is beneficial in a different town, but not here in Burlington? And if so, why?
And we'll start with Mr. Sachs.
Well, on the surface, you would say, oh, well, places like, I think one of the original aims was for farm towns that were seeing their farms chewed up quickly by developers. The open space was very attractive to them. But there are these 4 areas, or 3.5, you want to say: open space, recreation, historical preservation, and affordable housing, okay? I don't think there's any community that doesn't have some need in all of those areas. So I would say, from my point of view, well, I mean, I'm going to give you some very simple examples. A lot of people have said we don't need it because we can afford anything we want. But I would say to you, number one, we have people on the waiting list for affordable housing now, okay? Secondly, we have had historical buildings torn down for lack of funds. Beautiful historical buildings that we should be proud of are gone because there were no funds. CPA would have provided those funds, okay? We have, if you watch the video that Kevin Sullivan made that's on our website, he describes how he feels, as the Recreation Commissioner, that other communities, the CPA communities surrounding us, have much better fields than we do because they use CPA money to get them, okay? I have a feeling it may very well be that if we pass CPA, that most of the money will go into improving our parks. And on our videos on our website, you will hear from 3 young mothers, or 3 or 4 young mothers who really want the parks to be significantly improved. And one of the things that could be improved is the parks could be made accessible for children with disabilities. There's a modern movement going on where they're using playgrounds. They're building playgrounds now that are accessible to children in wheelchairs and with other disabilities, but that are also quite wonderful for able-bodied children. And I think that a lot of people would like to see us do that with CPA money.
Thank you very much. Mr. Iler, the same question.
Sure. I mean, there's no doubt that if you put a bucket of money in front of someone, they'll find a way to spend it. And I'm fairly confident that, you know, we'll even look at the projects and say that's a nice to have item, no doubt about it. The question is it our priority? So, you know, you could argue that a place like Lexington is getting more bang for their buck in putting it in historical items because they have a large tourist industry that, you know, I don't think anyone's coming to Burlington to see the old buildings realistically. It's nice to have a pleasant looking downtown and whatnot, but it's not our highlight. Similarly, since Burlington is highly developed at this point, there's limited new open space opportunities, unfortunately. Back when we bought the landlocked forest by eminent domain, that would have been a great use for it. But the number of opportunities like that are fairly limited. So I think the point is, a community that's already spending a lot in these areas, it might look like a nice way of funding those things. But if you look at how Burlington's spending money now, the SCPA committee has estimated that maybe we have $250,000 a year in capital warrant articles that are in CPA type projects. So if we assume we got the 40% match, that's going to be roughly $2.25 million going into the CPA funds. That means we're spending 9 times as much on CPA type projects as we are now. Similarly, the historical budget is $10,000 now, or $10,600. If we with CPA, we required to put at least 10% in, that'd be $224,000. That's a factor of 21 more money being spent in that area. So the point is, for our community, this is a vast increase in spending in those areas, which if that's what you want, then this is the way to accomplish it. But to date, it hasn't been our priority.
Thank you very much. And now we move to our closing statements. We will begin 2 minutes with Mr. Sachs.
I want to just say that I think that this CPA vote has a lot to do with values. What are the values of the town? We do have some open space left to preserve. What is the value of open space? Or making it accessible with boardwalks? Better playgrounds that are accessible. What is the value of that? There are historical buildings. When I first moved to Burlington, the Grandview Farm was about to collapse and be torn down, which every time I drove by, I thought it would be incredibly sad if this magnificent building were torn down. Well, in fact, it wasn't torn down, and CPA wasn't there to fund it. However, if CPA had been around, it would not have gotten to the verge of being torn down. Now, we do have other historical buildings. The Wyman family has been struggling for years to keep a 1666 building going with pretty much their own money. We have an 1890 magnificent building that the police are now using as a police station. It's not clear if the building can be saved because it has been allowed to essentially deteriorate. But if it can be saved, it's a many, many million-dollar project, and we would have a magnificent centerpiece in our town that would be like the other end of the Grandview. CPA, and I'm talking about many millions of dollars, CPA can pay for that, okay? So I would say to you, if you think that an old building should really just be torn down, then you might want to vote against CPA. But if you think that we should take pride in our great old buildings, even though we're not Lexington, then I think you should vote for CPA. Because, as Mr. Iler said, it's a huge increase. But I would say to you that in a $160 million budget town that does have historic buildings, to spend $10,000 a year is absurd. And I've met a number of times with the Historical Commission. What I would say to you is that they're very dedicated people, and some of them agree with me in that they have not been insistent enough to get the kind of money that is needed to keep up those historical buildings that we have, which is why the Grandview almost came down, and the Union School may come down as well.
Thank you. Closing statements, Mr. Iler.
Yeah, first, I'd like to thank Mr. Sachs. He gives a great debate, and he's always had great points in his Facebook posts and elsewhere. And to the CPA, yes, CPA folks, for running a really good campaign. They've done a great job organizing and get the issue out in front of people. And I think they've brought great value to the community in getting this on the table to get us discussing it. And I think we're in broad agreement on the facts. We're just drawing different conclusions from those facts. So CPA, as I mentioned, will force dramatically different spending in Burlington. We'd be spending 9 times our current CPA-related capital budget. So unless you think our current budgets are completely wrong, this doesn't really make sense. And of course, it's funded by increasing your tax bill. Generally, raising taxes as we enter a recession is the opposite of what most economists would generally recommend. The CPA is just a state's way of trying to exert control over local spending, basically, while perversely using money they took from us in real estate fees as an incentive. So the state partial match is supposed to be the big CPA carrot. It's been mentioned as great return your money. But given that the state match can drop to as low as 5% by law, counting on that is a bad reason to do something. If you think it's a good idea without the match, then it makes total sense. And as I mentioned, the state trust fund collections for CPA are down 22% relative to last year. So in general, earmarks such CPA aren't a responsible way to create a budget. They guarantee that spending won't be the highest priority items overall. The only thing they guarantee is that the spending will be the highest priority items for the CPA group. As total CPA projects grow each year, as I mentioned, the cost of operating and maintaining them gets added to the regular non-CPA budgets. So if you want to keep your taxes down and keep our budgeting responsible, I would vote no. And I'll just throw in a little plug here that if you'd like to hear more, both from myself and Mr. Sachs, I'd recommend listening to our podcast with Nikki Cadillac's Burlington Buzz. And furthermore, I'd say if CPA is whet your appetite to have more of a say in what happens in Burlington, I would really encourage you to get involved with town meeting or join one of the boards and committees so that you can be right in the thick of it. So thanks for tuning into the debate.
Well, that brings us to the close of our discussion. In closing, I thank both spokespersons, John Iler and Jon Sachs, for sharing their views with the people of Burlington on this important topic. Thank you, Greg Walsh of BNEWS. And finally, thank you, Jen Dodge and the rest of the staff and volunteers here at BCAT. Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 8th. In addition to choosing elected officials, the CPA question appears on the ballot as question number 5. If you haven't done so already, be sure to get out and vote. Make sure you take advantage of that right and responsibility. And thank you for watching.